The ballroom had just gone quiet for the evening's biggest announcement when Derek Voss took the stage instead of me, grabbed the microphone meant for my closing remarks, and told 300 donors that I'd been quietly diverting funds from the youth foundation we'd built together for the past 7 years. I was standing near the edge of the stage in my rented tux, still holding the folder with the numbers I'd planned to present, the one showing our biggest fundraising year yet, when Derek's voice cut through the room and stopped every conversation cold. He said it slow, almost gentle, the way you deliver bad news to someone you cared about, that he'd discovered irregularities in the accounts over the past few months, transfers that didn't match any approved program, and that as co-founder, he felt an obligation to be transparent with the people who trusted us with their money before another dollar changed hands tonight. My wife, Rachel, seated at the front table, went completely still, her wineglass frozen halfway to her mouth. Howard Ellis, our board chair, who had personally recruited half the donors in that room, turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't read, somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of doubt. A photographer hired for the event kept snapping photos out of habit, the flash catching Derek mid-sentence. And I remember thinking distantly that those photos would exist somewhere forever now, capturing the exact moment my name got attached to a word like thief in front of everyone who mattered to the foundation's future. A woman near the front table I recognized as one of our largest annual donors leaned over to whisper something to her husband, her hand covering her mouth. And I watched the ripple of that whisper move backward through the room table by table until the entire ballroom seemed to be holding the same breath. I said Derek's name once, quiet, the way you say a name when part of you still believes the person will catch themselves before going further. And he looked past me toward the crowd instead of at me, like I'd already stopped being the person he needed to answer to. Derek and I met in college, two broke kids volunteering at the same after-school program because neither of us could afford much else to do with our weekends. And somewhere in those early years, we decided we wanted to build something that outlasted us. We started Bright Path with $4,000 between us and a borrowed church basement. And for the first 3 years, we both worked second jobs just to keep the lights on while we grew it into something real. I remembered the winter Derek's car got repossessed, and I drove 2 hours out of my way every single morning for 4 months, just to get him to the office on time, never once making him feel small for needing the ride. I remembered handing him half of my own salary during our leanest year, so his family could make rent, telling him it wasn't a loan. It was just what partners did for each other. I remembered sitting beside him in the hospital waiting room the night his younger brother overdosed, the two of us not saying much of anything, just being there, so neither of us had to sit with it alone. I remembered the two of us staying up until dawn, writing our very first grant proposal by hand at his kitchen table, because neither of us owned a laptop yet, trading sentences back and forth until it finally sounded like something worth submitting, and the two of us hugging in that same kitchen months later when the grant actually came through. None of that mattered on that stage, under those lights, with 300 people suddenly wondering whether the man who'd built this foundation with him was actually a thief. What Derek didn't know, what only Rachel and our independent auditor knew, was that 6 weeks earlier I'd noticed a pattern of my own in the quarterly statements. Small transfers routed through a vendor account Derek personally managed. Money that never quite matched up with the catering and printing invoices it was supposedly covering. I'd first noticed it almost by accident, cross-referencing an old receipt for a supply order that seemed to run higher than what our regular vendor usually charged. And once I started pulling the thread, 3 more months of statements showed the same quiet pattern repeating itself. Instead of confronting him directly and risking a shouting match that would go nowhere, I'd quietly brought my concerns to Patel and Associates, the accounting firm the board had hired years earlier to keep us honest, and asked them to run a discreet review before I said a word to anyone, including Rachel at first, because I didn't want to accuse my closest friend of something this serious without being completely certain. Miss Patel had called me just 4 days before the gala to confirm what I'd feared, a pattern going back nearly a year. Careful, small enough each time to avoid triggering the usual red flags, but adding up to a significant sum once you laid every transaction side by side. I hadn't gone to the board yet. I'd wanted to talk to Derek privately first, give him a chance to explain himself before it became something neither of us could walk back. And I'd scheduled that very conversation for the morning after the gala, never imagining he'd beat me to the punch by turning the accusation on me in front of every donor who mattered to our future. The night after the gala fell apart, I barely slept, running through every version of how the next morning's board meeting might go, since Howard had called an emergency session before we'd even finished loading the folding chairs back into storage. Rachel sat with me at the kitchen table until nearly 3 in the morning, going through printed bank statements and old emails, trying to piece together exactly when Derek's access to the vendor account had changed and why. She kept a legal pad open beside her, jotting down dates and questions in her neat handwriting, occasionally reading one aloud just to hear how it sounded, before circling back to the statements again. At one point, she asked carefully whether I'd considered that Derek might actually believe what he'd said on that stage, that maybe somewhere in his own head he'd convinced himself the accusation was true because it was easier than facing what he'd actually done. I didn't have an answer for that. I just knew that whatever was in his head, I had 4 days of documented findings from an independent firm, and he had a microphone and a room full of people willing to believe him because he'd gotten there first. Around 2 in the morning, Rachel finally set the pad down, reached across the table, and told me that whatever happened at that board meeting, she already knew who I was. And that had to be enough to get me through the next few hours, even if nobody else in that room believed it yet. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a message from an old volunteer coordinator named Sarah, who'd worked closely with Derek on vendor contracts years earlier before moving to a different city. She said she'd heard secondhand through a mutual friend what had happened at the gala and wanted to tell me something she'd sat on for a long time, unsure if it mattered. She said that back when she still worked with us, Derek had once called her late at night, clearly stressed about money, and admitted he'd been quietly padding a few vendor invoices to cover a gap in his own finances, promising her he'd pay it back before anyone noticed, and begging her not to mention it since it was, in his words, a one-time thing he was embarrassed about. She'd believed him back then and let it go, assuming he'd fixed it, but hearing what happened at the gala made her wonder if it had never actually stopped. She wrote that she'd nearly deleted that old voicemail a dozen times over the years, feeling strange about holding on to something so private, but something had always made her keep it, and now she finally understood why. She said she still had that call saved, an old voicemail Derek had left her afterward, apologizing again and asking her to keep it quiet, and she'd send it to me if I thought it would help. I told her it might help more than she knew, and within the hour, the file was sitting in my inbox, Derek's voice from years earlier, sounding almost exactly like the voice that had accused me on that stage, just aimed at a different apology this time. The board meeting the next morning was tense from the moment everyone sat down. Howard opened by saying the foundation couldn't move forward until this was resolved one way or the other, that donor confidence was already shaken, and every hour of uncertainty made it worse. Derek repeated his accusation from the night before, calmer this time, more rehearsed, laying out a folder of his own with numbers he said proved I'd been the one manipulating the vendor account. I let him finish completely before I said anything, because I wanted the board to hear the whole story he'd built before I started taking it apart. Then I told them about the review I'd quietly requested from Patel and Associates 6 weeks earlier, and Ms. Patel, who Howard had asked to join by phone given the seriousness of the meeting, walked the board through her findings line by line, showing that the vendor account transfers traced directly back to changes made under Derek's login credentials, not mine, going back nearly a year before I'd ever raised a concern. She pulled up a shared screen with a spreadsheet color coded by login timestamp, and even the board members without a finance background could see the pattern clearly once it was laid out that way. A cluster of small transfers every few weeks, always just under the threshold that would have triggered an automatic flag in the system. Derek said the login system was shared, that anyone with office access could have made those changes. And for a moment, a few board members looked uncertain, like maybe that explanation held up. Howard asked Ms. Patel directly whether the shared login theory was plausible given the access logs, and she said the building's keycard records, which she'd also pulled as part of her review, showed Derek alone in the office during nearly every window when a suspicious transfer occurred, a detail that made the shared login explanation considerably harder to believe. That was when I played Sarah's voicemail on speaker, Derek's own voice from years earlier, apologizing for padding invoices to cover a personal shortfall and asking her to keep it between them. The room went completely silent, the only sound the faint hiss of the phone speaker itself between his sentences. Derek's face changed the way a person's does when they realize the story they've been telling has just collapsed in front of the only people whose opinions still mattered. He tried to say the voicemail was old, unrelated, taken out of context. But Howard cut him off and asked flatly whether he was denying it was his voice on the recording. And Derek didn't answer that question at all. Just stared down at the folder in front of him like the numbers inside it might rearrange themselves into something that still worked in his favor. One of the newer board members, a woman named Elaine, who'd only joined the previous year, asked quietly whether this meant the pattern had likely been going on even longer than the recent audit showed. And Ms. Patel said that based on what she'd just heard, she'd recommend expanding the review back several more years to be thorough. Derek stood up without another word and walked out of the room, and nobody stopped him. The fallout moved quickly after that. The board voted unanimously within the week to remove Derek from any role at the foundation and to pursue restitution for the misappropriated funds through the organization's attorney. Two major donors who had been on the fence after the gala called personally to say they respected how transparently the situation had been handled and were increasing their pledges rather than pulling out. A local news outlet that had been prepared to run a story about donor fraud at Bright Path instead ran a much smaller piece praising the foundation's swift internal accountability, which Howard said afterward probably saved us more in future donations than we'd ever recover from Derek directly. The regional nonprofit association Derek had once served on a panel for quietly rescinded his invitation to speak at their annual conference that spring, citing scheduling changes that everyone in that small world understood weren't really about scheduling. Even so, three smaller donors quietly stopped giving anyway, unwilling to separate the foundation's name from the scandal, no matter how it had been resolved. And I understood that some trust, once cracked in public, doesn't fully come back no matter how clean the resolution looks on paper. Derek came to my house on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks later looking thinner than I remembered, his jacket hanging looser on him than it used to, and said he was sorry that the money had started as a small emergency loan to himself during a rough patch years ago, and he'd simply never found a way to stop once it became a habit he was too ashamed to admit to anyone, especially me. He said he told himself for years he'd pay it all back once the foundation's budget had more room to breathe, but the gap only ever seemed to grow instead of close. And eventually the shame of admitting it felt bigger than the debt itself. He said accusing me first at the gala had been a panicked, cowardly decision made in the hour before the event, when he realized the auditor might already be closing in, and that he regretted it more than almost anything he'd ever done. I told him I believed that the shame was real, and that believing him didn't change what I needed to do next, which was make sure the foundation's attorney had everything necessary to recover what could still be recovered. He nodded and said he understood, and he asked quietly if there was any version of the future where we'd ever be friends again. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that 7 years of trust doesn't just evaporate, but it doesn't rebuild on a timeline either. And that was the most certain answer I had for him that day. He stood on the porch a moment longer, like he wanted to say something else, then just nodded once and walked to his car, and I didn't watch him drive away this time. The unexpected part came a month later, when Howard called to say that despite the financial recovery process going smoothly, several founding board members felt the foundation's name itself was now too tied to the scandal in the local community's mind, and that a fresh start under a new name, with a rebuilt board and a public new leadership structure, would likely serve the mission better than trying to fully rehabilitate the old brand. It wasn't the outcome I wanted. Watching the name Derek and I had built from a church basement quietly retired. The same name that had been painted on our first delivery van and stitched onto every staff polo shirt for 7 years. But I understood the logic. And within 2 months, we relaunched as the Northgate Youth Alliance with nearly the same programs, most of the same staff, and a noticeably more careful set of financial controls built into everything from day one, including a new rule requiring 2 signatures on any transfer over a modest threshold. Rachel asked me one evening, sitting on our back porch, whether it felt strange letting go of the name we'd poured 7 years into. I told her it felt less like losing something and more like finally setting something down I hadn't realized I'd been carrying wrong for a long time. A name that would always now carry Derek's shadow alongside everything good we'd built with it. If you've ever built something with someone you trusted completely, only to watch them try to burn it down to save themselves, you know that the hardest part isn't proving the truth. It's accepting that some things don't survive intact even after the truth wins. If this story hit home for you, hit like and subscribe. because there's another one coming next week.